Hi everyone, and welcome back to The Negotiation. Now, there are very few observers from the West who know China better than today's guest, Anne Stephenson-Yang. So we decided to extend our discussion with her to try and get as much great content as possible. And in doing so, we have the luxury of splitting the conversation into two. So today you're getting part one, and next week's episode you'll hear part two. Anne is a self-described mutt when referring to her background of starting so many different companies in China. Anne is American born and raised, but has lived in the People's Republic of China for more than 25 years. In 2008, she co-founded her most recent company, which was renamed to J Capital in 2011, which is an independent research firm that focuses mainly on Chinese companies and the macro environment. In this part one episode, we begin by talking about the decoupling of manufacturing by the US from China, which has garnered a lot of attention lately, and whether it will actually happen, as well as Anne's surprising take on whether China has actually changed over the last 25 years in which she's lived there. We also ask Anne what the thoughts and sentiments are about the US elections by first Chinese citizens and then by the government. We also discuss the TikTok and WeChat situation in her eyes and the impact on the international business community. We close part one with a fantastic discussion on why Anne believes Alibaba, and Tencent as well, are terrible investment targets, and how and where we can find decent data to indeed make good investment decisions on Chinese companies, and how she knew before almost anyone that Luckin Coffee's numbers were fraudulent. Enjoy.
Alibaba is just a ridiculously huge black box into which the Alibaba PR team just throws all of these assets and says, look, we have something worth $10 billion and we're not telling you what it is. Now we have something worth $30 billion and we're not telling you what it is. It's just a ridiculous investment target.
Home to over 4 billion people, the Asia-Pacific region boasts one of the most powerful consumer markets on the planet. Not only is it home to half the world's under 30 population, but it's also home to more than half the world's internet users. It's a market no globally minded brand should ignore, but entering markets like China is no easy task. Just ask the likes of Microsoft, Google, Uber, and Facebook. Times are changing, and with the right partners, doors are slowly opening as more and more companies find success expanding into the markets of the Middle Kingdom. I myself spent 8 years in China, mostly as a venture capitalist, helping early-stage tech companies enter the Asia-Pacific market successfully. This show is dedicated to uncovering and examining successful China entry and growth strategies by interviewing the people behind those success stories. My name is Todd Embley, and welcome to The Negotiation, brought to you by WPIC Marketing and Technologies.
Anne, thanks for coming on the show today. Really appreciate your time.
Well, thank you for having me.
Let's start with manufacturing and the uncoupling of manufacturing being thrown around, right? Okay, so the preliminary or the preceding thesis around manufacturing is lowest wages, least regulations. And that has led to reaching out and driving up manufacturing in a lot of other areas of the world and not doing it at home. Now, I think COVID brought, and the struggle with logistics that brought about, now it's being rethought. Now they're discussing uncoupling, not just from the issues with COVID as well. Tell us a little bit about where you see this uncoupling going. And if we look ahead to 3 years from now, do you think there are going to be something like two internets, for example?
Wow, that's a broad question. So first of all, I would take a little bit of issue with your characterization. I think it's a little bit more complicated than that in China, the question of offshoring. China, it's what China says about itself is that it's developed in three stages with three strengths. The first strength was cheap labor, and that was superseded by cheap IP, and that was superseded by cheap capital. And I think that that's really true. What's brought people to China is not so much the cost of labor as the low cost of capital and the attractiveness of the international markets of market listings. So and what has hurt the American worker or the average American citizen about China is not so much competition from cheap labor, but the way in which the U.S. political system has recycled the profits from China back into the pockets of the top 1 or 0.1% of the population, rather than investing in American capacity, American infrastructure, American education, American plant and equipment, and all of that sort of thing. So it's a little bit more of a subtle dynamic than just China stole our jobs. It's more like, in my view, the plutocrats stole our, the benefits of having offshored. If you were alive in the 1970s and 1980s, as I was, you would have offshored. I mean, there wasn't any question about it. And all of these kind of Midwestern, machine tools companies in the U.S., they were intensely uncompetitive and inefficient. And so I remember all of this stuff going on. And, you would see these companies, these textile companies from North Carolina, or these machine tool companies from some suburban Chicago place in Illinois. And, they couldn't make things at even, China was making similar stuff at 40% cheaper. And it wasn't all because of the labor. It was because of, cheaper capital, cheaper technology, all sorts of stuff. And because these companies were essentially inefficient because they hadn't had competition for a really long time. So, when you see a kind of Chinese company with a lot of people who really work hard and really care and are making exactly the same ball bearing that they've invented themselves for 30% lower price, you have to cheer for them and not feel like they're just stealing stuff. Instead, that it's actually healthy to be exposed to competition. The problem that occurred was that you had all of these companies. I mean, here's an interesting comparison to make, because now the SEC is requiring listed companies to provide information on the multiple between the CEO salary and or compensation generally, and the average compensation in the company. So you can compare what the average CEO in America is earning now with what the average CEO was earning. You have to do a little more work to figure it out, but in 1982 and 1983. And, if you work for, let's say, Weyerhaeuser, and you're cutting down trees on a slope all day, and you earn, I don't know what you earn, $25, $30 an hour, you're exhausted, you're working hard, you've ruined your back by the time you're 45. And you earn $30 an hour, and the CEO of Weyerhaeuser is earning what? $12 million a year. Is his contribution to the company really worth so much more? Or is his position in the company just such that he's able to leverage that? So, I mean, it's a fundamentally, I digress a little here, but the point is that the benefits of having saved all this money, squeezed efficiencies out of companies, made American companies more efficient, those are all good things. The problem is the benefits all flowed into the CEO's pockets and the pockets of a few shareholders. That's the problem, not the problem with, competition.
Right. So do you think that there will be an uncoupling? Let me just start there.
No, I don't think there will be a decoupling. I think there will be actually a rejoining of a lot of and a strengthening of international institutions to allow the United States to try to force China to negotiate on stuff. There are some fundamental problems with whether China is capable of participating in these institutions because it's such a fundamentally different system. But at least you have some kind of chance at getting that done, rather than what's been going on lately, which is ban and then negotiate, get everybody really hostile. They walk away from the table, and we end up with almost exactly the same deal that we originally had. Like maybe we have, a slightly lower tariff on dairy products or some damn thing, but basically it's the same.
You're saying that it eventually these negotiations, for whatever it's worth, end up most of the time coming back to a bit of a net zero. I mean, do you think 3 years from now that's where we're going to be?
No, I think that, I think that China is challenged in a lot of very, very serious ways, and that a lot of what's happening with the U.S. hostility toward China has to do with the disillusionment of capital because China just isn't producing the growth and the income that was expected and that it was in the past. And so there's a lot of kind of bitterness in China that doesn't really have much to do with what China is doing or what the US is doing. It has to do with the natural slowdown of that economy and the coming to the end of the type of development strategy that China has used, and that's only going to become worse as years go on. I think that China is rapidly fading from the international scene as an economic player of great importance, and I think that that's going to continue to happen. And it's not because of U.S. decoupling; it's because of that's just what China has chosen through its developmental model. I do think that we need to, there's an awful lot of stuff being produced in China, awful lot of U.S. companies that are making money in China, and we need to figure out ways to protect their interests, to strengthen their negotiating power, to protect their intellectual property, and so on and so forth. And that means strengthening international institutions rather than abandoning them.
That's a fascinating statement to say that they are going to go backwards from international prominence economically. Everybody, I think, most people, I think, would expect the opposite of that they are only growing in importance. And then, and I really would like a more discussion around that, because you're saying this is actually by design, that this is something that China is choosing. Why would they choose that?
Well, I would say two things to that. The development model itself, it's not choosing to be important or not be important. It's that the development model is based on massive and growing capital investment, and that type of development model reaches a shelf life, or it reaches a growth limit, and then it starts to unravel. This has happened in all sorts of countries around the world, and it's happening in China, perfectly predictably. As for what China wants, I mean, I would say that China's coupling with the international world, which started in 1979 and became important in the 1990s, was done really as a kind of deliberate strategy to capture as many resources as possible, resources in terms of technological expertise, intellectual property, and of course, capital more than anything. And the idea was always to make China as presentable and as like America as possible, enough that those benefits would start to flow into China. And when that process reached its peak, then they were always going to go backwards. And that's what's happening now. So there's never been any question about changing China's fundamental institute. In fact, when people hear that I lived in China for 25 years, they always say to me, "Oh, you must have seen so many changes." And I always think to myself, I may say different things, but I think to myself, yeah, kind of. I mean, physically, the place has changed a ton. Yeah. But really, internally, structurally, the way people think, the way they're educated, the way, certainly people have an awful lot more things than they used to have. But has China fundamentally changed that much? I don't really see that. Yeah. Well, I think you're obviously tuned in to a lot of different frequencies than a lot of people, which is what makes you such an excellent guest on the show right now. But you're going to take that. They may not have kind of meant it in that way. They were probably, talking about infrastructure or, the style of cars or the adoption of cars or, the prevalence of cars or ride sharing, whatever. They talked about maybe more obvious things than that. I remember when I went to China for the first time, my first thought was, I need to get in the crane business because this is incredible. They've changed their physical landscape a lot. But yes, you're right. I think the underpinnings of what makes China has not changed very much.
May I ask just one more little colorful question on the back of the last one, which is, how does the One Belt, One Road, how do you put the One Belt, One Road puzzle piece together with the rest of what's going on with, as you say, where China's going?
I mean, what's really to put together? It's an instantiation of the Chinese attitude toward going abroad, which is like, put on our wetsuit and get our tanks and, all of our scuba equipment, and then get a diving bell too, to make sure we're totally protected and in our own system when we leave China, and then come back as soon as we possibly can. That's the Chinese attitude toward going abroad. So the Belt and Road is a matter of establishing Chinese institutions that the Chinese government controls, so that they don't have to, mess with the IMF or the World Bank or any of those things, because you want your whole Chinese institution. So, there are plenty of multilateral funding institutions already. Why did China need a whole separate set? That's because of the fundamental lack of structural change in China, not because it represents structural change.
Let's talk about the election, the U.S. election, which impacts, a lot of the world. So everybody cares. Would you say that the Chinese citizens favor Biden or Trump? And does that answer change if we talk about what we think, who the government favors?
Yeah, the people are a totally separate issue from the government. So, the average person in China, as far as I can tell, is pretty flummoxed by Trump, as everybody is. Like, who is this crazy person and how did he get to be president? It's just the most bizarre thing. How can a big nation have a president who doesn't know when the Second World War ended, for example? It's just crazy, crazy, crazy. But, what the government thinks is a much more difficult thing to figure out. You get a lot of, I think that institutionally within China's, political institutions, there still is a lot of support for Trump for the obvious reasons, which is that Trump is very, is tearing apart the fabric of U.S. society. And in the long run, that's a good thing for China. In the short run, clearly it's not, because of all this trade friction, but you do still get a lot of, blocking any positive comment on Biden on WeChat, promoting any positive comment about Trump, lack of muted response by the official newspapers to comments by Trump that are negative on China. All of these things indicate that the Chinese political system is still, I'm sure there's a lot of debate about it, and I certainly haven't, I'm not privy to that, but I think they're still kind of supporting Trump.
1 degree of separation from that conversation, let's talk about a little bit about the TikTok situation. Microsoft now, I don't know, what are we at, 40 days to kind of close that deal. What do you think of the long-term implications of just this whole TikTok, WeChat thing in general?
See, I think that this is, I think that the Trump administration's periodic attacks on China about the COVID virus and calling it the China virus are a typical representation of this type of strategy. Like, there's a lot of problems with social media. There was a great book last year called About Surveillance Capitalism by somebody named Shoshana Zuboff, which I highly recommend. Surveillance capitalism and the deployment of personal data by, Google, Facebook, Apple, and all of these similar companies, and of course, WeChat and Tencent and Alibaba, is a huge problem. Who's more competent to misuse personal data, Microsoft or ByteDance? Totally Microsoft, right? So that's the problem to address. The problem to address is not who is collecting this data.
Do you think that American brands could potentially significantly suffer in the Chinese market if they need to remove their accounts from WeChat?
You could imagine that there will be that WeChat will not be allowed to put its updated software into the app stores. You could imagine that advertising in Tencent and on WeChat and through Tencent games and stuff would be banned. I think that's unlikely. It would be difficult. It would be difficult just to point that at one company. I'm not sure what mechanism you would use to do that. If it did happen theoretically, would it be a problem? Yeah, it would be a problem. Sure.
Okay. Do you think that some of these big tech e-commerce darlings of the Chinese land, the Alibabas, the JDs, Tencents, and things like this, you have said before that you figure it's probably just a matter of time before they default on their debts and then delist. Why do you think that, if you still believe that?
Oh, very good. Looking that up. No, I think that Alibaba is one of the biggest frauds ever perpetrated on the investing public, and I think Tencent is pretty damn fraudulent too. Do I think that they'll default on debt? I haven't looked at their financial statements in quite a long time, so I really can't say which debt they have and which is payable in dollars and at what time and when they'll default on it. So that's a level of precision that I really don't have over these companies because I threw up my hands on them a long time ago. What I think is that the Alibaba is just a ridiculously huge black box into which the Alibaba PR team just throws all of these assets and says, look, we have something worth $10 billion and we're not telling you what it is. Now we have something worth $30 billion and we're not telling you what it is. It's just a ridiculous investment target, but it'll die when it dies. And, my theory with Alibaba has always been that once the market starts to deflate and Alibaba shares start to become less valuable, then one of the Chinese telcos will just absorb it and it will become part of China Mobile or something like that.
You were really early on figuring out that Luckin Coffee's reported numbers were not what they were. You were one of the first to the game on that and then figuring that out. How did you do that? And I mean, I'm asking that almost because I want to know, how in the heck do any of us diligently and correctly understand what actually is going on? Like, where do we go to find numbers that we can trust and believe, even if we are investing or, looking at Alibaba, looking at Luckin, just trying to believe any amount of money that a startup raised?
Yes, so I think Luckin's a good example because I think it's actually not hard. It is hard with some companies. They're the Enrons of the world, but then there are the Luckins of the world. And the reason it's not hard is because you use common sense. And that's something that's in pretty short supply on Wall Street, because Wall Street is full of financial analysts who have accounting backgrounds and finance backgrounds, and they see companies as financial instruments. They don't see companies as actually living, breathing things where people do stuff and make stuff and sell stuff. And, I have plenty of weaknesses as a financial analyst, but I think a strength is that I have lots of experience operating companies, and I know what's hard and what's easy and what growth prospects really are likely to be. So when you see a company like Luckin, when you go into a Luckin, and I've since I spend a lot of time meeting with people at coffee shops in China, so I've probably gotten 5 or 6 free cups of coffee from Luckin, because all you have to do is register with a different number and then they'll give you a free coffee because they value your data more than your money. There was one time when I went to a Luckin in Nanjing when for some reason I was just refusing to use my Alipay account. I can't remember why, and WeChat. And I was really hungry, but they wouldn't sell me anything in cash. And I walked through the place and I ended up drinking hot water and typing on my computer for an hour. And I walked through the place to use their bathroom and everybody was doing the same thing. And you just think to yourself, how is it that this company is growing so fast and so profitable and yet nobody's paying them money? And then you see, what does Luckin really focus on? Oh, it focuses on coupons, on getting members and issuing coupons. Something wrong with that. That's really all. That's as sophisticated as it is.
But it is interesting because you have a financial analyst background, as you mentioned. How do you identify other companies in the China market, in the APAC region? How do you find companies in those markets to short?
Well, a lot of different criteria, but I would say that the fundamental criterion is the common sense criterion. So if you, for example, have, an auto parts company, because auto parts is just a brutally competitive area, and auto companies know exactly what their suppliers have in margins, and they don't allow them margins above 20%. So suppose you have an auto parts company. One of my favorite companies to hate is called Gentex, and an American company in Michigan, and Zeeland, Michigan. And they make auto mirrors. And I think the gross margins are down to maybe 39, 40% now. But come on, I mean, companies that make robotics have 20% gross margins. How come you make a rear view mirror, you have 40% gross margins? You don't. You're just not telling the truth about it. So there's an awful lot of areas like that where you have, let's say it's a solar panel company, and you know how much brutal competition there is in the solar panel industry. So why is this one company super profitable and these other companies aren't? Or, a company that we wrote on about over a year ago called A.O. Smith, which makes water heaters. The thing that attracted me to that company was simply, so this company gets 30% of its revenue from China, and it's keeping 85% of its cash in China. So if I were a corporate CFO, I would definitely not do that. Why is this company doing that? Oh, it must be doing it because it can't take the cash back. So in other words, logical chain of thought leads to, this company's got to be lying about what it's doing.
Okay. Isn't there another step? And I'm admittedly fairly naive in a lot of this world. So I'm going to speak for all my listeners out there like me and ask maybe a naive question, but doesn't it take everybody to know and understand the things that you're seeing in order for there to be an actual market correction around how people look at how successful and how well off and how well these companies are doing, more than just somebody being very smart and realizing that, hey, this is a bubble and it's going to burst? Doesn't everybody have to realize that? Isn't there like a whole market shift that has to happen? Yeah, for sure. So, there are some investors that take positions for a really long time. And so for them, the fundamentals of a business, like this is just a crappy business that everybody is excited about for the moment, but it's going to fall apart, then that analysis works for them because they have a 5-year or 10-year time horizon. So eventually it happens and they're not in a big hurry. But there are a lot of people who need stuff to happen within the next, quarter or the next half year. And stuff doesn't happen unless, if you need that, then you need the total frauds. You can never say when they're going to fall apart because it depends on a whole lot of random factors. The companies that are probably better to short in that, or let's just say that in when you're looking for a short-term catalyst, then you have to look for stuff like, is this company going to run out of cash? Or is this company, company going to default on a debt? Or is this company in a, more pedestrian manner? Is it just not going to make the growth numbers that everybody thinks it's going to? Safe to say that part of what your company does then isn't just identifying what companies are, let's call it, living on the edge, but not that the bubble will probably burst, but when it's going to happen, because there has to, like you said, there has to be some sort of catalyst where it then propagates the shift en masse. And that's, not just knowing that it's going to happen, but when is the key.
Yeah, and you can't know that. So that's what makes shorting companies a lot harder than longing companies.
Okay, that's part 1, everyone. I hope you enjoyed it. We'll be back next week with part 2 of our discussion with Stephenson-Yang, where we discuss China's housing bubble, the current currency exchange, and just how strong Xi Jinping's grasp on power is in China. Until then, have a great week and stay safe.
Growing a company is hard. Doing it in a foreign market? Exponentially so. The best piece of advice I can give you is not to do it alone. When you start looking across the pond for further expansion possibilities, and I sincerely hope that you do, make sure you choose the right partners to do it with. My good friends at WPIC Marketing and Technologies have almost 20 years of experience helping brands just like yours enter China. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The Negotiation, and if you're interested in being a guest or want to connect with me or any of our team, please reach out to us at podcast@wpic.co. And be sure to rate, comment, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Zaijian.